It's discussion time. In my last discussion video, we went over the hypothesis of espionage being a reason for the missing or deceased U.S. scientists. This discussion will look at some alternative explanations for the missing or deceased scientists. We'll also look at UAP programs and covert government tasking. And this will include two main hypotheses, one of them being covert government tasking. And with this hypothesis, we'll examine whether scientists could have been recruited into classified programs, which would require sudden or prolonged disappearances. The second hypothesis we'll look into is the UAP/UFO program, and we'll also look at the protective disappearance hypothesis here. So this would be that these scientists were connected to some sensitive research, such as the UAP or UFO related work or research that we've all been hearing about, and they were possibly reassigned covertly, possibly placed under a protection, or they had their deaths and disappearances staged to mitigate any kind of risk from disclosure of these programs. Both of these hypotheses do discuss real elements of intelligence and defense practices. However, I'm going to be clear and state there is no verified public evidence supporting either as a broad explanation for these multiple cases. However, we are going to examine the limited plausibility of this being possible under specific conditions. I feel it's always important to start with the historical context, so that's where we're going to start. When we look at the historical context of covert assignments and secrecy, we do know that personnel in intelligence or military roles have at times been deployed without any kind of notice. They've also been restricted from contacting family, and they have been assigned to compartmentalized missions. There were programs during and after the Cold War that were revealed indirectly through efforts like the Venona Project, and these programs demonstrated that there is long-term secrecy. It is very possible. It also demonstrates that families were sometimes kept uninformed. Operational compartmentalization was very strict. These practices were typically applied to trained operatives and or military or intelligence personnel. It's not really a pattern you would see with civilian scientists. In a scenario where there was covert government tasking of these scientists, the scientists would all have specialized knowledge, and they'd possibly be recruited into classified programs. This would require immediate departure, which we've seen with these scientists. This would require no external communication, which we've seen, and this would require a long-term absence, which we've seen. We know that the U.S. government conducts classified research programs. That's a given. Scientists are sometimes required to obtain high-level security clearances, and we all know this. That's a given. And we should all know that their work may be compartmentalized, which means basically it's limited disclosure, even within their teams. For this to explain the cause of the missing persons cases we see with the scientists, several issues would arise. Civilian scientists can't really just simply disappear without any kind of employment records, without financial traces, and without institutional awareness. Although details would be pretty much withheld from the family, complete disappearances without explanation is highly unusual. Multiple disappearances would absolutely require a whole lot of coordinated concealment across different agencies and a whole lot of suppression of records and inquiries. And that is not an easy task to do when it's scaled with multiple people. Ultimately, unexplained and total disappearances are not a standard method. But it is plausible that these individuals were recruited into some type of classified program. So now what about a UAP UFO program and protective disappearance? Well, we all know there's recent attention on UAP, which is unidentified aerial phenomenon, and the potential declassification efforts. We do have relevant public context here. The investigations by entities such as the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office and the congressional hearings on UAP transparency. Potential declassification efforts could have led to these scientists being reassigned or actually hidden. It's possible it could have led to deaths or disappearances being staged, or some type of protective measures to prevent targeting or disclosure. This hypothesis is actually very intriguing to me. UAP-related research is acknowledged as real, although it is very limited in scope publicly. And we all know that there are some defense programs that do remain classified for national security reasons. So protective measures for sensitive personnel can and do exist in high-risk scenarios. Now, when we bring it down to reality, staging deaths and disappearances would require a lot of coordination. This would be coordination across multiple independent systems, so manipulation of medical, legal, even investigative, which would be law enforcement, coroners, doctors. There would be a lot of manipulation across these multiple independent systems in order to stage a death or disappearance. In the missing scientist cases, we do have a lack of correlated evidence here. There is no consistent link between these missing scientists and UAP research roles, or any kind of government reassignment patterns. We know that obviously these individuals were valuable, so keeping them active and productive would be more beneficial than removing them from public existence, unless it was a classified program. And obviously, there are a lot of public exposure risks in large-scale staging operations. So there's high risk for leaks and or whistleblower exposure. With the risk to the government, for a covert tasking operation, especially if it's a UAP protective type of disappearance, it could actually be extremely high. It wouldn't be the first time that a government has run a secret type program, and individuals historically have been assigned to different missions without full transparency. But we do have to stay grounded in truth and reality here, and explaining these unexplained deaths or disappearances to this type of a protection program would require some additional evidence, obviously. We would need some connections that these individuals were all working on a specific program. We would really need evidence of coordinated concealment and something that shows a consistent operational pattern. So that evidence has not really surfaced within, not publicly anyway, within these missing and deceased scientist cases. Even while trying to draw from legitimate aspects of intelligence and defense operations, this hypothesis really remains speculative without any kind of supporting evidence. There would have to be some type of extreme risk threshold. So we'd have to understand under what conditions the U.S. government would accept extremely high legal, political, and operational risk to hide or remove a scientist from the public view. We'd have to kind of look at what risk level would justify this and what supporting factors would have to be present. So let's get into what counts as extremely high risk to the government. For domestic protective operations to reach this type of level, the perceived threat would have to include multiple converging risks. So, a catastrophic intelligence compromise, per se. This would be exposure of capabilities that would undermine national defense or that would potentially reveal classified technologies or vulnerabilities. This would be comparable historically to breakthroughs that shaped entire eras, like nuclear or cryptographic intelligence, as underscored by programs later illuminated through efforts like the Venona Project. This could also result from immediate targeting by foreign adversaries. So, if there was credible intelligence that these scientists were actively being targeted for recruitment or abduction, or that they were under any kind of surveillance by a capable foreign service like China or Iran and Russia, it would be plausible. This could be applied in a scenario where escalation of sensitive programs could be exposed. So these programs would have to expose something that would trigger geopolitical escalation or reveal some type of covert actions or capabilities that would have diplomatic consequences. This could also be applied when there is a irreplaceable human asset. So an irreplaceable human asset would generally be defined as an individual that holds non-replaceable unique knowledge, or they have some type of insight that is not fully documented and it's not transferable. There is a protective measures spectrum that actually exists, and this is important to understand the hierarchy of protection. There is low to moderate risk. So this would be security briefings for individuals. This would be monitoring their travel, and there would be some travel restrictions, and it would also be increased counterintelligence oversight. So that would be defined as low to moderate risk. There is elevated risk. So if an individual is in an elevated risk, they will have some type of physical protection, usually some type of security detail. They will have controlled movement or reassignment, and there will be very limited public exposure about them. Now, if an individual reaches a high risk, this would be when relocation might come into play, and it's sometimes done very discreetly. There would be identity shielding in specific contexts, and there would be a lot of compartmentalization of work and contacts they might have. And then under extreme risk, there could possibly be deep cover relocation or even a full identity change. There would be complete removal from their prior life. So in this extreme risk threshold, it is rare and it's tightly constrained. And this is where our hypothetical theory would live. So it would be extreme. And if a government were to simulate a death or allow a disappearance narrative, it would definitely introduce some compounding risks to them. There would be a huge risk for legal exposure for them, because in order to make it happen, it would require falsification across death certificates, like I said, the investigations, and possibly even medical or forensic records. This would have to be a multi-system coordination. So we're talking law enforcement, administrative systems, potentially those independent entities like hospitals and coroners. So when you think about that, each additional participant increases the chance of a public leak. They would have the risk of political fallout if exposed. So if that happened, there would be a pretty severe loss of public trust, which right now is the last thing the government needs. There would also be congressional and possibly legal consequences, and possibly even international credibility damage. The more complex the operation, the higher the chance that someone speaks out or that documentation will surface later on. That would leave huge whistleblower risks for the government. And there would be absolutely some type of strategic trade-off. So there would be government losses. First of all, they would lose the individual's public identity, and they would lose their ability to operate openly in their field. And that could ultimately lead to reducing long-term value unless the threat is truly exceptional. They wouldn't go to those lengths. For this to be completely plausible, we would need to know whether the scientists are directly tied to a highly sensitive or compartmentalized program. There would have to be some type of credible, active targeting by a capable adversary. The standard protection, like normal security, relocation, and monitoring, would have to be deemed insufficient for these individuals. There would have to be some type of exposure of the individual's identity or role that would cause a strategic level of damage. The operation would also have to be executed with minimal footprints and compartmentalization. So in order for this to be plausible and these extreme measures to be justified, all or most of those would need to be true. And even then, the default preference for the government would still be some type of quiet relocation and not a disappearance or death narrative. Keeping it grounded in real principles, governments will take significant measures to protect sensitive knowledge and the personnel when the stakes are high enough. Bottom line here would be that the operational risk to the government often would equal or exceed the threat that is being mitigated. So it would be rare. And it's possible that there would be at least some indirect signals over time, which those signals really haven't been consistently observed in cases involving the US-based scientists. We would really need to look for the positive indicators of a protection scenario, not just try to explain something unusual. And there is protective operation red flags that we can look for. Sudden security escalation, any kind of behavioral shift. And these would have to be extremely driven behavioral shifts. So what I mean by that is these individuals might have mentioned they were told not to discuss work anymore, or they become really cautious about their routine activities. So it wouldn't just be like a stressor or an emotional type of behavioral shift, but it would be very specific and pretty much situational caution. The biggest red flag to look for would be a trigger event indicator. So this is usually something that forces a protective measure. This would be defined as a breach or some type of leak that's connected to their field, some type of rising geopolitical tensions involving their area of expertise, possibly public attention on a sensitive topic. So a sensitive topic would be defense tech, any kind of emerging systems, or even the UAP-related discussions involving entities like the All Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Any of these red flags are great to look for. However, the trigger event indicators are definitely usually what would force a protective measure. So without this trigger, extreme action is unlikely. Another good identifier would be a lack of resolution over time. So the case would generally not progress normally. It wouldn't produce the expected investigative leads, and it wouldn't escalate publicly either, in the way that a high-profile, unexplained case involving U.S. scientists usually does. Real protective operations are usually quiet, controlled, and minimally disruptive. This material is speculative and analytical. Scenarios involving espionage, classified government programs, unidentified aerial phenomenon, or UAP, and the potential protection of sensitive personnel. It is intended for discussion. It's intended for creative interpretation, and it's intended for critical thinking purposes only. These concepts presented do not represent confirmed facts, verified intelligence, or any kind of official positions of any government agency or organization, including entities such as the CIA or the Department of Defense. Certain historical references, such as the Venona Project, are factual, but their inclusion is meant solely to provide context. It should not be interpreted as evidence supporting any of the theories discussed here. There is no claim that I'm making that missing or deceased scientists are linked to espionage, foreign recruitment, covert government operations, or UAP-related programs. The connections that are drawn are hypothetical, and they are not supported by publicly verified evidence. Approach the material with critical thinking to distinguish between documented facts and speculative interpretations. Seek out credible evidence-based sources when evaluating this real-world event. This content should not be used as a basis for factual conclusions, any kind of accusations, or any real-world decision-making. These hypothetical scenarios involve topics that are not commonly talked about, and that's just because there's not widely spread public exposure to these type of operations. To somebody who has not been exposed to these type of government operations, these theories could sound very far-fetched and impossible. But to those of us who have been exposed to these types of government operations, these hypothetical theories could absolutely be plausible. It really comes down to having an open mind to be able to acknowledge things that you don't know, you can't see, and that you can't explain because you've never had any kind of exposure to it. These are hypothetical scenarios in which the public has every right to look at you like you're crazy, because exposure for the general public of these types of operations lives within movies and TV shows. It's not actual real life. It really only becomes real life when you are actually exposed to it. The public also tends to have a hard time accepting these type of hypothetical scenarios. And that's just generally because when there's no exposure and then all of a sudden the truth comes out, it kind of feels like the Truman Show. Like what you've believed your whole life is not anything close to what the reality was. And this also kind of relates to why there is such a lack of government trust these days. I do really encourage viewers to acknowledge possibilities that are outside the norm, in these cases with the missing and deceased scientists. And regardless if those theories might sound like a plot to a movie. As I always say, sometimes life is stranger than fiction. I hope this video encourages critical thinking into different plausible explanations for the missing and deceased U.S. scientists. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.